Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the November 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we are continuing our reading of Lavender in Red by Leslie Feinberg from 2004. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So we want to thank the Workers' World Party for hosting this under a Creative Commons license at workers.org. And before we begin the reading, I just wanted to give a little bit of feedback to some of the comments that I had seen on some of the earlier installments of this series, specifically the ones that dealt with the rollbacks in the early USSR during the Stalin years. Some of these comments were hyper-defensive, I would say, and rather showing a sort of studied defense of the USSR and its policies, were kind of knee-jerk, and to me came off as readers who were not really comfortable dealing with criticism. Not everything that happened in the USSR was the best outcome, there was a struggle going on, and not even everything that Stalin did was perfect. Now, obviously the USSR and Stalin have been maligned very unfairly, but there are also things that as communists we do need to look at critically and try to learn from, rather than trying to bend over backwards to rationalize literally everything that happened. Some of these comments I really did think were off the mark. Anyway, let's begin. Chapter 21, East Germany. Forming of gay groups ignites church struggle. In January 1982, in East Germany, the Evangelical Academy Berlin-Brandenburg held a conference titled, "Can One Speak About It? Homosexuality is a Question for Theology and Pastoral Care." Lesbians and gay men took part in the conference. The agenda reportedly focused on how to use insights of modern sexology to reduce prejudice and harmful concepts about homosexuality, and how to provide a structure for lesbians and gay men to get together and discuss their own issues. This conference generated a public forum about same-sex love. Later that year, some gay and lesbian activists in Berlin and Leipzig formed the Homosexual Working Group within the youth section of the Lutheran Church. The group quickly spread to more than 20 cities, not just the big urban areas like Magdeburg, Chemnitz, and Rostock, but in small towns like Zwickau, Plauen, and Neustrelitz. The Leipzig and Dresden groups were founded by theologians who had been denied ordination because they were an out gay man and an out lesbian woman. Buried in that last fact is a reminder that organizing by lesbians and gays continued to face opposition from the Protestant hierarchy, even if tactically it was a useful political tool for the church. Like the Catholic Church and the Polish workers' state, the Protestant Church battled the socialist German state. Raylan J. Hillhouse stated that during the early years of the GDR, quote, "the church and state often were in an undeclared war in which neither expected the other to survive. Because of its close relations with the West German Church, the East German Church was seen by the state as a foreign institution," unquote. The East German Church had close ties to the hierarchy in the capitalist West. While the young worker state curtailed the church's social role, it did not seize church property and continued to use public funds for pastoral training. In concessions to the church in the early 1960s and in 1978, the state signed accords which opened the door for the church to expand its outreach. As a result, close to 200 groups formed under the organizational umbrella of the church. These included lesbian and gay, environmental, disabled, and the dubiously vague category of human rights. Specifically, the objectives of the gay groups, offering support and counseling and educating parishioners about homosexuality, was not political in nature. However, the goal of addressing social problems, while vague, did open the door to criticisms of the socialist state. The overall coalescing of more than 200 organizations under their aegis gave the church hierarchs a wider social base from which to pursue their anti-communist opposition to the workers' state. Struggle broke out within church. Not everyone at the top of the church ladder was so happy about allowing lesbians and gays into the fold under any circumstances. Hillhouse observed in her 1990 article on sexual politics and social change in the GDR that, quote, "the presence of lesbian and gay organizations has brought about a major controversy, both within the church, which has customarily condemned homosexuality, and among gays and lesbians, who have traditionally been persecuted by the church," unquote. She explained that in 1986, based on the results of a church commission study, a bishops' conference did conclude that biblical condemnations of same-sex love should no longer be used as justification for discrimination. However, she stressed, quote, "although the bishops settled one controversy by officially allowing gay and lesbian groups to meet within the church, they refused to take a clear position on the ordination of homosexuals. The church has, however, demonstrated the limits to its acceptance of homosexuals in its repeated denial of ordination of Edward Stoppel, the director for homosexual work of the Magdeburg City Mission, because he lives in a homosexual partnership, unquote. Dennis M. Sweet, a researcher quite unsympathetic to the socialist state, did note the hostility to gays within the church. Quote, "These working groups did not advance without concerted resistance from within certain well-situated Lutheran and charismatic factions within the church, particularly from the south of the GDR with its own traditions of theology and piety. So much so that the church authorities in Saxony felt obliged to append within the territory of their administration a publication that countered the largely positive and tolerant brochure Homosexuelle in der Kirche, Homosexuals in the Church, ? Issued in 1984 by the Central Office of Theological Study of the East German Church. Quote, "This Saxon alternative brochure warned about, quote, militant homosexuals forcing an entry into the church to advance the, quote, ideology of homosexual emancipation," unquote. That's from Sexual History of the Political Left. And lesbians and gay men were not so thrilled about working under the auspices of the church either. John Parsons made this point sharply, quote, "Of course, many homosexuals, including those who were members of the Communist Party, were not comfortable with the church and did not find this association helpful," unquote. Hillhouse added, quote, "As was the case with groups from the other social movements within the church, the gay and lesbian associations were not entirely religious. Perhaps as few as 10% of the members identified themselves as Christians," unquote. Commenting, "Not entirely religious or barely religious at all," continuing. But a new and dramatic development was emerging in the mid-1980s that allowed the lesbian and gay movement to burgeon. The GDR worker state opened up a widespread secular campaign to combat prejudice and discrimination against same-sex love. Part 22. Great Gains in 1980s East Germany. Quote, "Finally, in the late 1980s, public discussion backed by the Communist Party and the state was revived," wrote researcher John Parsons in his extensive article about gains for lesbian and gay men in the German Democratic Republic. Quote, "It included lesbians and gay men speaking out as self-conscious voices for their community," unquote. And that article was in Out/Look, summer 1989. And yeah, that's normally pronounced Outlook, but I want to make sure everybody knows what the title is if you're not familiar. Continuing, scientists and health professionals convened a conference in June 1985 on the psychosocial aspects of homosexuality. Parsons stressed, quote, "An important feature of this conference was that it was organized with the open participation of lesbians and gay men both as contributors and discussants," unquote. He continued, quote, "Two major demands were voiced at the conference. First, that the discussion should be taken outside of these exclusively professional circles and made a public one. Second, that the state should sanction institutions through which lesbians and gay men could discuss and organize among themselves," unquote. A year earlier, the same demand for independent groups had been voiced by a Humboldt University interdisciplinary research group that had been organized at the request of the Berlin City Administration. This was the first official gay and lesbian studies committee at a German university, according to researcher Raylan J. Hillhouse. The Communist Party's 11th Congress in 1986 debated the recommendations of the research group. Parsons said that a member of the Humboldt University group relayed that there was, quote, "a good deal of success in moving the national party apparatus to support the work of these groups," unquote. Parsons talked to other acquaintances who added that there was continued backwardness from some party officials. But what is indisputable is that in 1985, an historically unprecedented state-sponsored campaign set out to eradicate all forms of discrimination based on sexual and emotional preference, and to raise social consciousness about same-sex love. The momentum of gains for sexual liberation in the German Democratic Republic that resulted was dramatic. The facts speak for themselves. Government-backed media campaign. A government-supported public discussion broadened and deepened in the period between the 1985 conference and a second held in the city of Karl-Marx-Stadt in 1988. Hillhouse concluded in her 1990 article that, quote, "the new openness concerning homosexuality was evident not only in literature and scientific publications, but also in print and broadcast media. In 1984, the popular monthly health magazine, Deine Gesundheit, Your Health," which incidentally, when people say Gesundheit after sneezing, it means health, began printing a series of readers' letters on homosexuality. Soon after, several other major publications published substantial articles on sexual orientation, unquote. More than 200 articles on homosexuality were printed in the GDR during the 1980s, she continued, mostly about gay males. Articles about same-sex love appeared in the press and were incorporated into some state radio and television station programming. Much of this information was aimed at youth, an audience with many questions about sexuality. When public media focused on AIDS education, same-sex relations were not portrayed as a central feature, and it is important to recall that everyone in the GDR enjoyed free medical care. The television health program Visita broadcast a report in September 1989, quote, that described homosexuality as an entirely natural variation of human sexuality, unquote. The following year, the state film company DEFA, working with gay and lesbian activists, produced East Germany's first documentary about the, quote, satisfactions and problems facing same-sex couples, called Die andere Liebe, or The Other Love. In 1989, DEFA also released Coming Out, a feature film about a gay teacher. The same year, literature with gay themes was published, including a book about the life histories of several gay men in the GDR, compiled and written by a gay man. Mass education campaign. Quote, important social institutions also began to implement reforms with great speed, Parsons continued. Quote, for example, the Commission on Marriage and the Family, which is responsible for running a system of counseling centers, passed a resolution asserting that the National Network of Sexuality and Family Counseling Centers should aid in dismantling prejudices regarding homosexuality and foster the integration of gay men and lesbians into society, unquote. Same-sex love was significantly included in a new sex education curriculum for the public school system. A chapter on lesbian and gay identity in the 1984 edition of the Standard Sex Education textbook presented homosexuality as a natural variant of sexual identity. Lesbianism was part and parcel of this chapter. The book included among its sexually frank and romantic photos 2 men together and 2 women lying naked in each other's arms. And most significantly, the book acknowledged that the main problems faced by homosexuals result from persecution and isolation, which themselves stem from social discrimination and homophobia. Part 23. Gay and Lesbian Clubs and Party, State. In a landmark ruling on August 11, 1987, the Supreme Court of East Germany set the minimum age of consent for all sexual relations at 14. This addressed an important legal inequity. In 1968, when the 19th century Prussian anti-gay laws had been abolished, paragraph 151 was established, which set 18 years old as the minimum age of consent for same-sex relations. The minimum age for heterosexual relations remained 14. The 1987 court decision overturned the conviction of a man who had sex with a youth. The judges found that the minor was openly gay, had visited gay clubs and parties, and had sought sexual contact. The only basis for conviction, they ruled, would have been if the sex had not been consensual or the youth had been harmed. The written ruling created a legal milestone. The justices wrote, quote, the starting point for a judgment about the sexual relations between persons of the same sex must be the principle that homosexuals, just as much as heterosexuals, are members of the socialist society and are guaranteed the same rights of citizenship, unquote. And the court continued, quote, homosexual relations between an adult and a person between the ages of 16 and 18 do not necessarily lead to an abnormal development and do not have any other harmful consequences than homosexual relations between 2 youths or heterosexual relations between an adult and a youth, unquote. The justices concluded, quote, discrimination against homosexuals and bigotry is therefore to be opposed. Homosexuals are to be protected by legal regulations and judicial punishment against attacks on their integrity, for example by slander or physical violence or rowdiness, through civil as well as criminal proceedings, unquote. In 1988, the government in East Berlin declared all discrimination based on sexual orientation illegal. And in July 1989, the East German Parliament officially removed the age of consent discrepancy from the law books. Satisfying material needs. But the gains for lesbians and gays in the GDR were not merely legal. As the planned economy demonstrated momentum, even while encircled and undermined by the capitalist West, living standards rose for all in the GDR, including gays and lesbians. And as the economic struggle for survival eased, so did social relations. An extensive article in the winter 1989 Slavic Review by researcher Raylan J. Hillhouse was not particularly sympathetic to the Communist Party and the state, which were shouldering the task of building socialism in the GDR. But Hillhouse made this pithy observation, quote, when a socialist state satisfies basic material needs and provides its citizens with a sense of material security, its citizens may gradually shift their political interests to moral matters, gender issues, environmental concerns, and similar issues. The relatively reliable stables of satisfaction of basic material requirements in the GDR make such transitions there probable, and East German values concerning marriage, gender roles, and sexuality indeed have been liberalizing." Unquote. These important advances in social progress were made possible by communist political campaigns to raise consciousness, and in turn resulted in raising mass consciousness even higher. One important indication of this political commitment to change was the creation of gay and lesbian clubs within party and state institutions, and gay and lesbian organizations won official recognition from state officials and moved into the public arena. The most significant of these was the Berlin Sunday Club. The group emerged from private discussion circles in the late 70s. In the early 1980s, the group became more semi-official when officers of a neighborhood youth club worked with gays and lesbians to organize Sunday discussions, cultural events, and trips. The club's application for a cultural and consultation center for gays and lesbians was denied in 1983 and 1984 by the city. But the applications in part helped to propel the Berlin administration to request the creation of the research group at Humboldt University in 1984, the first official gay and lesbian studies committee at a German university, to study the conditions facing the estimated 750,000 gays and lesbians in the GDR. Part 24. Gains cut short by 1989 Counter-Revolution. The official Gay and Lesbian Studies Research Group, formed at Humboldt University in 1984 at the behest of the Berlin City Administration, examined the conditions of life for some 750,000 gays and lesbians living in East Germany, or the GDR. The following spring, this group issued the following findings. The lack of a clear social policy on homosexuality in the GDR had resulted in a lack of state-sponsored social services for gays and lesbians and contributed to emigration. And discrimination and intolerance led to sexual activity which could exacerbate the AIDS crisis. The study recalled the historic role of German revolutionary workers' parties in supporting the German homosexual emancipation movement's demand to remove 19th-century anti-gay legislation, and it concluded by calling on the Communist Party, SED, to aid in the struggle for gay and lesbian rights. Researcher Raylan J. Hillhouse says that the Humboldt group proposed that, quote, the state should help homosexuals to integrate into socialist institutions and should strive to eliminate the public prejudice toward homosexuality. These goals, the report held, should be accomplished through legal reform, continued research, the creation of gay and lesbian clubs, expansion of counseling centers, and media campaigns. All these proposals were implemented on various government levels, unquote. This recommendation was sent to the party. In 1985, Hillhouse noted, quote, the Politburo responded to the study with the recommendation that the integration of homosexuals into GDR society should be encouraged, unquote. And when the party responded to this call, it also recalled the history of German communism's early and strong support in the battle against anti-gay laws. East Germany issued an electrifying call for an end to all forms of legal and social discrimination against lesbian and gay people that sent shockwaves around the world. In the United States, The Advocate, a gay and lesbian news magazine, reported, quote, East Germany's official ADN news agency has issued what appears to be an officially approved call for an end to discrimination against gays in all levels of East German society. The news agency asserted that socialist guarantees of proletarian equality extended to gay people, and that non-gays should assist their gay comrades in casting off the bonds of anonymity, discrimination, and disadvantage, unquote. Even if this had been merely lip service to the struggle for gay and lesbian liberation, it would have been a striking call to raise societal consciousness. But the sweeping progress made within just a few short years showed that the left current of the Communist Party and the workers' state was taking action. Walking the talk. The Gay and Lesbian Sunday Club, or Sonntagsklubb, won official recognition in 1986, becoming the first state-sponsored gay and lesbian group. Researcher John Parsons added, quote, other parts of the subculture have also come into greater public view, including regularly organized dances in public halls, unquote. In 1987, the Sunday Club affiliated with the House of Culture of Berlin Mitte. Similar organizations were formed in Dresden, Gera, Leipzig, Magdeburg, Potsdam, and Weimar. Quote, also in Berlin, Hillhouse wrote, the League of Culture has allowed the Magnus Hirschfeld Study Group to organize under its auspices to promote scientific inquiry about homosexuality. The state-supported marriage, sex, and family counseling centers began special staff training programs in issues of sexual identity. In addition, other organizations occasionally sponsored educational projects on homosexuality as well as social functions for gays and lesbians, unquote. In 1987, she added, the Ministry of Health commissioned a volume on homosexuality in the GDR. It appeared in two unusually large editions. Quote, the author, Rainer Werner, urged that lesbian and gay counseling centers be created, allocation of apartments to same-sex couples be expedited, and legal partnership for non-married couples to administer their common property be considered, unquote. A national conference, similar to the psychosocial aspects of homosexuality in 1985, was convened in 1988, quote, explicitly to include lesbians and gays in East German society, unquote. Several speakers at the second conference emphasized the importance of changing family law to ensure state recognition of gay couples and families. The Communist Party Youth Group, the FDJ, a mass organization, not a cadre party organization, produced several programs about homosexual and bisexuality on its radio station. A film and a forum on homosexuality, and a social for gays and lesbians were components of the May 1989 FDJ Youth Festival, and the FDJ Central Council directed its local groups to help create gay and lesbian clubs wherever they were needed. The former first secretary of the Central Council of the FDJ issued a statement that emphasized the importance of equality for homosexual youth. The statement added, quote, I can assure you that the FDJ will continue to give great attention toward the complete equality of homosexual youth and other citizens in its diverse forms of political and ideological work, unquote. The process of liberation. When John Parsons, a Canadian researcher, published his 10-page report in 1989 on gays and lesbians in the GDR, he wrote from the vantage point of 6 previous years of research. Quote, back in 1983, Parsons recalled, the lesbian and gay subculture in East Germany was still very much underground, although not illegal. But he explained, quote, by 1989 things have changed dramatically. Public displays of homosexual affection remained rare, but gay liberation has made significant and surprising progress in a short period of time. Not only is the gay subculture in the early stages of coming above ground, but the process of liberation is now developing with the active support of the Communist Party. Lesbians and gay men, communists and non-communists alike, are exploring anew what sexual liberation means in a socialist society, unquote. He stressed, quote, the public discussion of homosexuality now being promoted by the Communist Party is one in which homosexuality is finally recognized as a natural aspect of sexuality and society, unquote. The lesbian and gay movement in the GDR debated whether to develop an autonomous community or integrate into society. The leading view of the movement and the state, Parsons reported, quote, is one in which autonomy is not set in conflict with integration. Lesbians and gay men have a need to meet together for personal, cultural, and political reasons. Their ability to collectively discuss and decide their views on their oppression and needs is an important step in enabling the society as a whole to address the issues. Integration, however, is also seen as a positive goal. Not an integration in which lesbians and gays hide their identity, but one in which their unique identity contributes to and changes the whole, unquote. Parsons reported these gains without glossing over the problems that still existed, bringing great sensitivity and objectivity to his observations. He noted, for example, quote, the Communist Party itself is not a monolithic institution. There are millions of members with various views on sexuality and sexual politics, and it is no surprise that different views should win sway at different times. But, he added, what is striking is that the party has moved so quickly from a position of at best benign neglect to one of clear advocacy for a reasoned, humanistic, and in many ways radically progressive position, unquote. Counter-revolution. During the late 1980s, as the more compliant Gorbachev leadership was weakening the socialized economic base of the Soviet Union in the name of perestroika, the imperialists, from Wall Street to Bonn, exerted tremendous pressure on the Soviet leaders to withdraw their support for East Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe. The deal was finally made in a 1989 meeting between Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze and U.S. Secretary of State James Baker while boating on Lake Jackson in Wyoming. The USSR would not intervene if capitalism were restored in Eastern Europe. This left the GDR sandwiched between imperialist West Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia, which themselves were being taken over by bourgeois elements. In 1989 to 1990, the workers' state was overturned and the GDR was incorporated into capitalist West Germany. East German workers lost free healthcare and education, low-cost rent, and the guarantee of a job. And for lesbians and gay men, quote, reunification with capitalist West Germany meant the re-imposition of the hated 19th century Prussian law against homosexuality, paragraph 175, which had still not been repealed there, although that finally did happen in 1994. Not to be forgotten is that in the relatively short space of little more than 4 decades after World War II, Lesbian and gay liberation had made swift strides in socialist East Germany that had no parallel in the capitalist world. In fact, during that same span of time, life for lesbians and gays in the US and Western Europe was characterized by the iron fist of state repression.